The envelope held $500 more money than Penelope Barrett had seen in her life, and all she had to do was make one man fall in love with her, then shatter him in front of the whole town. Virginia City sprawled across the Nevada hills like a promise kept and broken at once, silver pouring from the earth while men poured their wages into saloons and gambling halls. Penelope had arrived 3 weeks earlier with her father, Thomas Barrett, whose cough had grown worse with each passing day until she could hear the rattle in his chest from across their single rented room above the butcher shop. The mountain air was supposed to help, the doctor in Sacramento had said, but mountain air cost nothing and doctors cost everything, and her father was dying by degrees while she watched. The 3 young men who approached her outside the post office wore suits too fine for practical work and smiles too practiced for genuine warmth. The one in the middle, Arthur Pemberton, did the talking while his companions flanked him like bookends. "Miss Barrett, isn't it? We have a business proposition that might interest a woman of your particular circumstances." She should have walked away. Later, she would remember that moment as the one where she could have chosen differently. But her father had woken that morning spitting blood into his handkerchief, and desperation made people do things they never imagined themselves capable of. What kind of proposition? She asked, keeping her voice level. Arthur's smile widened. "There's a man in this town, Graham Oakley, owns the Silver Queen mine and a ranch north of here. Made his fortune but never learned to spend it on anything interesting. Dull as dishwater, really, and we've grown rather tired of his company at the Territorial Club. We'd like to see him taken down a peg or two. I don't understand what this has to do with me. We've noticed you're clever, Miss Barrett, and quite pretty when you're not wearing that worried expression. We'd like you to court Mr. Oakley, make him fall in love with you, and then break his heart publicly. There's $500 in it for you, paid in advance. All we ask is that when you do the deed, you do it somewhere we can watch. The miners' ball in 2 months should do nicely." The other 2 men snickered, and Penelope felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You want me to hurt someone for your entertainment?" "We want you to teach an arrogant bore a lesson about humility," Arthur corrected. "Graham Oakley thinks his money makes him better than everyone else. We simply want to remind him that he's as fallible as any man. Besides, from what I understand, you need the money rather desperately. Your father's medical bills must be mounting." She hated that he knew about her father, hated the knowing looks the 3 of them exchanged, hated most of all that she was standing there considering it instead of slapping Arthur Pemberton across his smug face. But $500 would pay for a real doctor, the kind who might actually be able to help instead of just shaking his head sadly and recommending mountain air. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're new enough that he won't suspect anything, smart enough to pull it off, and desperate enough to say yes. Are we wrong?" She took the envelope. The weight of it felt like 30 pieces of silver. Graham Oakley first spoke to her 4 days later at the general store, and nothing about the encounter suggested he was the arrogant bore Arthur Pemberton had described. She was examining a bolt of blue calico, trying to calculate if she could afford 3 yards to make her father a new shirt, when a voice beside her said, "That's a good color. Practical, too. Doesn't show the dust." She turned to find a man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with brown hair that needed cutting and hazel eyes that had seen too much weather. His clothes were well made but worn from actual use, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who did his own work despite having the money to hire others. "I'm sorry," she said. "The blue calico. I buy it for my ranch hands' wives sometimes, and they always seem pleased with it. Wears well." He seemed suddenly aware that he'd started a conversation with a stranger about fabric and looked embarrassed. I'm Graham Oakley. I don't think we've met, Penelope Barrett. She shook his offered hand, which was warm and rough-palmed. I arrived a few weeks ago with my father, from California. Yes, Sacramento. The doctor said the mountain air might help his condition. Something shifted in Graham's expression, a shadow passing behind his eyes. Is he ill? His lungs. He was a printer by trade, and I think the chemicals affected him over the years, or perhaps it's just age. He's only 52, but sometimes he seems much older. Graham was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if she'd said too much, shared too intimate a detail with a stranger. Then he said, "There's a doctor here, Samuel Morrison, who's better than most. He studied in Philadelphia. If your father hasn't seen him yet, I'd recommend it. His office is on Union Street above the pharmacy. I'm sure he's very expensive. He is, but he's also decent enough not to turn away someone who needs help." Graham picked up a tin of coffee beans from a nearby shelf, clearly preparing to end the conversation. "It was nice meeting you, Miss Barrett. I hope your father improves." She watched him walk to the counter and pay for his items, exchanging easy pleasantries with the shopkeeper, nothing in his manner suggesting superiority or arrogance. When he left, the shopkeeper noticed her watching and smiled. "That's Mr. Oakley. Good man. Doesn't put on airs despite having more money than sense. Bought out half the widow's mortgages last year when the bank threatened foreclosure. Didn't ask for anything in return, just said it was the Christian thing to do." Penelope bought her calico and walked back to her room, feeling the envelope of money burning in her pocket like a coal. Her father was sleeping when she returned, his breathing labored and wet-sounding. She sat beside his cot and counted out $50 from the envelope, then walked to Union Street and climbed the stairs above the pharmacy. Dr. Morrison was younger than she expected, perhaps 40, with graying temples and a direct gaze that missed nothing. "My father is very ill," she told him. "I can pay $50 now and more later. Can you help him?" Dr. Morrison asked careful questions about symptoms and history, took her $50, and promised to visit that evening. He came as promised, examined Thomas Barrett thoroughly, and prescribed a tonic along with a list of foods that might help strengthen his system. "It's consumption," he said quietly to Penelope while her father dozed. "I won't lie to you, Miss Barrett. It's advanced. But there are things we can do to make him more comfortable and possibly extend his time. He needs better nutrition, clean air, and complete rest." "How much will it cost?" "My fee is $2 per visit. The tonics will be additional, but don't worry yourself sick over money right now. Let's focus on getting him stabilized." After the doctor left, Penelope sat in the darkening room and tried to convince herself that taking money to break a man's heart was justified if it kept her father alive. The logic felt sound until she remembered Graham Oakley's eyes, and the way he'd suggested the doctor without being asked, as though helping were simply what people did for each other. She engineered their next meeting carefully, timing her afternoon walk to coincide with the hour when Graham typically left the assay office. Virginia City's streets were crowded with miners and freight wagons, and it took no great skill to appear surprised when she encountered him outside the International Hotel. "Mr. Oakley," she said, adding just enough warmth to her voice to suggest pleasure at seeing him. "Miss Barrett. How is your father?" "Better, actually. Dr. Morrison has been wonderful. Thank you for recommending him." Graham's expression eased into something approaching a smile. "I'm glad to hear it. Are you heading somewhere particular or just escaping your room for a while?" "The latter, mostly. I'm afraid I'm not used to being idle. In Sacramento, I worked as a seamstress, but I haven't established any clients here yet. You might talk to Mrs. Chen at the boarding house on B Street. She's always looking for someone who can do alterations, and she pays fairly." Tell her I sent you if you like." They walked together for several blocks, and Penelope found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Graham talked about his ranch with real affection, describing the herd of cattle he was building and his plans to dig irrigation ditches for better grazing. "Most people think silver is the only thing worth pursuing in Nevada, but the land has potential beyond what's underground. You just have to be patient with it." "You sound like a farmer at heart," she observed. "My father was, back in Missouri. He always said that silver makes you rich but land makes you permanent. I didn't understand what he meant until after I made my fortune and realized that nothing about it felt solid. Everything in Virginia City is temporary, people chasing the next strike. I wanted something that would last." "Is that why you bought the ranch?" he nodded. "And why I've been working on making the mine safer instead of just squeezing every last ounce of silver out of it. Men die in mines, Miss Barrett. I've seen too many funerals already, and I'm tired of being responsible for them." There was something heavy in his voice, a weight that spoke of more than general concern. She wanted to ask about it, to understand the shadow that crossed his face, but that would mean pushing into territory that felt too intimate for a woman supposedly trying to manipulate him. Instead, she said, "That's admirable. Most owners only care about production. Most owners haven't watched someone they love die underground." The words hung between them, stark and final, and Penelope felt something twist in her chest. Before she could respond, Graham seemed to shake himself free of whatever memory had gripped him. "Forgive me. That was dark. I should let you get back to your father. Please give him my regards." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Penelope standing on the corner feeling like the worst kind of mercenary. Over the following weeks, she continued to cross paths with Graham Oakley, each meeting carefully planned to seem coincidental. She learned that he was widowed, that his wife Elizabeth had died 2 years earlier, that he lived alone in a house too large for one person, and threw himself into work to avoid the emptiness. She learned that he was unfailingly courteous, quietly generous, and carried himself with the particular loneliness of someone who'd learned not to expect companionship. She also learned that Arthur Pemberton and his friends were watching her progress with keen interest. They cornered her outside the dress shop one afternoon, Arthur's smile sharp as a knife. "You're doing well, Miss Barrett. We've heard Oakley has been seen with you quite regularly. Do remember that we're paying for results, not just flirtation. The miners' ball is only 6 weeks away." "I'm aware of the timeline," she said coldly. "See that you are. We'd hate for your father to lose access to Dr. Morrison's excellent care because you couldn't follow through on our agreement." The threat was barely veiled, and Penelope felt her hands curl into fists. "I'll keep my end of the bargain. You just make sure you stay out of my way." But the truth was that keeping her end of the bargain was becoming harder with each conversation she had with Graham. He started calling on her formally, visiting her room to bring supplies for her father, broths from the hotel kitchen, books to help pass the time, once even a thick quilt when he noticed how thin their blankets were. Thomas Barrett, sensing something developing between his daughter and their benefactor, gave his quiet approval. "He's a good man, Penny. I've asked around about him. People respect him, and that's worth more than money." If only her father knew that money was exactly why she was encouraging Graham's attention. The afternoon that everything shifted, Graham invited her to visit his ranch. "I know it's not entirely proper, but I thought you might enjoy seeing something beyond Virginia City streets. I'll have Mrs. Patterson from town come along as a chaperone, if that would make you more comfortable." They rode out on a Sunday morning, Mrs. Patterson proving to be a cheerful older woman who clearly approved of Graham and spent most of the journey telling Penelope stories about what a fine employer he was. The ranch itself spread across a valley north of town. The house a solid two-story structure built from lumber that must have cost a fortune to transport. Graham showed her the barns, the cattle grazing in fenced pastures, the beginnings of his irrigation system. "It's beautiful," Penelope said honestly. "Peaceful." "It is. Elizabeth loved it here. She used to say it was the first place she'd lived that didn't feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong." Graham leaned against a fence rail, looking out over the valley. She grew up in a mining camp in Colorado, so she understood what it meant to live somewhere temporary. This was supposed to be permanent for us. "What happened to her?" Penelope asked gently. Graham was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice rough, he said, "Cave in at the Silver Queen. 3 years ago, before I implemented the new safety measures. Elizabeth used to bring lunch to the miners sometimes, said they shouldn't have to eat cold food in the dark. She was underground when part of the main shaft collapsed. They got most of the men out, but Elizabeth and 2 miners were trapped in a side tunnel. By the time we reached them, it was too late." Penelope felt the words like a physical blow. "Graham, I'm so sorry. It was my responsibility. I cut corners on the support timbers because silver prices were down, and I was trying to maintain profits. $15 per timber was the difference between secure tunnels and dead miners, and I chose to save the $15. Elizabeth died because I cared more about money than safety." "You can't truly believe that." "I know it for a fact. The engineer told me we needed to replace the timbers. I told him to make do with what we had. 3 people died because of that decision, and one of them was my wife. So yes, Miss Barrett, I believe it completely. I've spent the last 2 years trying to make up for it, but you can't really atone for killing someone you love. You can only try to make sure it never happens again." He turned away from the fence, his expression carefully controlled. "I'm sorry. I didn't invite you here to burden you with dark history. Let's go back to the house." Mrs. Patterson was planning to make dinner, but Penelope caught his arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her hand. "You're not responsible for your wife's death. You made a business decision that had terrible consequences, but you didn't kill her. The mountain did. The instability of the rock did. The randomness of fate did. You've been carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry." Graham looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, and something in his expression cracked open. "Do you really believe that?" "I do. And I think Elizabeth would want you to forgive yourself." He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his fingers warm and slightly trembling. "How is it that you've only been in my life a few weeks, and you've already seen more clearly than anyone else?" "Because I'm supposed to be studying you for weaknesses," Penelope thought with a surge of self-loathing. "Because I took money to break your heart, and I've been watching you closely enough to find where you're most vulnerable. Because I'm exactly the kind of person who doesn't deserve your trust." Out loud, she said. "Sometimes it's easier for strangers to see things clearly. We don't have the same biases." They had dinner with Mrs. Patterson, who kept up a steady stream of pleasant conversation that required little response, then rode back to Virginia City as the sun set behind the mountains. At the door to her room, Graham took both her hands in his and said, "Thank you for today, for listening. I haven't talked about Elizabeth with anyone in a long time. I'm glad you felt you could tell me. I'm starting to feel I could tell you anything." He hesitated, then added, "I'm aware that I'm not the most exciting company, Miss Barrett. I don't gamble or drink to excess or attend fancy parties. I'm just a rancher who happens to own a mine, but I find myself hoping that might be enough for you." Penelope felt something crack inside her chest. "You're more than enough, Graham. You're one of the finest men I've ever met." The smile he gave her was like sunrise, transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. Then perhaps you do me the honor of accompanying me to the miners' ball next month. I haven't attended since Elizabeth died, but I think it might be time to start living again. The miners' ball. The deadline Arthur Pemberton had set for her public humiliation of Graham Oakley. The moment when she was supposed to complete her bargain and earn her blood money. I'd be delighted, she heard herself say, and hated every letter of the lie. The next morning, Dr. Morrison stopped by to check on her father and found Penelope crying at the kitchen table. Thomas was out for a walk, taking advantage of a good morning to stretch his legs, and she'd finally allowed herself to break down. "Miss Barrett." Dr. Morrison set down his bag with concern. "Is it your father? Has he taken a turn?" "No, he's actually doing much better, thanks to your care." She wiped her eyes roughly. "I'm just being foolish." Dr. Morrison pulled out the other chair and sat down. "I'm a doctor, which means I'm professionally obligated to tell you that crying isn't foolish, it's healthy. What's wrong?" And because she was exhausted and frightened and drowning in guilt, Penelope told him everything. About the bet, the money, her father's illness, and how she'd taken the job thinking Graham Oakley was some arrogant rich man who deserved to be taught a lesson, only to discover he was decent and kind, and still carrying the weight of his wife's death like a penance. Dr. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively darker. When she finished, he said carefully, "You know that Arthur Pemberton and his friends are essentially asking you to commit a cruel act for their entertainment." "I know, but my father was dying, Dr. Morrison." "He still might die, depending on how much care he needs. I didn't see another option." "There's always another option. The question is whether we're willing to see it." He drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. Arthur Pemberton is a spoiled child who's never faced real consequences for anything. His father owns the freight company and has spent years cleaning up Arthur's messes. This bet is just another game to him. It's not a game to Graham. No, it isn't. And that's why you need to tell him the truth. Penelope felt her stomach drop. "I can't, he'll hate me." "He might. But he'll hate you more if you go through with the plan, and you'll hate yourself either way. At least if you're honest, you give him the choice of what to do with the information." Dr. Morrison stood and picked up his bag. "For what it's worth, Miss Barrett, I don't think Graham Oakley is a man who holds grudges against people who are genuinely sorry. He spent 2 years punishing himself for a mistake. He understands human fallibility better than most." After the doctor left, Penelope sat for a long time staring at the wall. She thought about the envelope of money hidden under her mattress, now containing only $450 after Dr. Morrison's fees and her father's medicines. She thought about Graham's smile and the way he'd held her hands and said she was more than enough. She thought about Arthur Pemberton's smug face and his threat about her father losing medical care. Then she thought about the kind of person she wanted to be versus the kind of person she was becoming. The decision crystallized slowly, but once it formed, it felt inevitable. She would return the money, expose the bet, and accept whatever consequences came. Graham would probably never speak to her again, and Arthur would make sure her father lost access to Dr. Morrison. But at least she'd be able to look at herself in the mirror. She just needed to do it in a way that made sure Arthur Pemberton and his friends faced consequences too. Over the next 3 weeks, Penelope continued seeing Graham while quietly planning her confession. He took her driving in his buggy, introduced her to his ranch foreman and the miners at the Silver Queen, brought her father books and medicines without being asked. Thomas Barrett improved steadily under Dr. Morrison's care, the color returning to his face and his breathing easing. He started talking about finding work again, perhaps at the newspaper, and Penelope watched her father come back to life while knowing she'd soon destroy any chance of happiness for herself. Graham kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening, standing outside her door after walking her home from dinner at the International Hotel. It was gentle and questioning, his hands cupping her face with infinite care, and when he pulled back his eyes were bright with something that looked dangerously like hope. "I wasn't sure I'd ever feel this way again," he said quietly. "After Elizabeth died, I thought that part of my life was over. But you've reminded me that there's more to living than just surviving each day. Thank you for that, Penelope." She kissed him again instead of answering, trying to memorize the feeling because she knew it might be the last time. The miners' ball was held at the Opera House, which had been decorated with enough bunting and candles to transform it from its usual shabby grandeur into something approaching elegance. Penelope wore her best dress, a green silk she'd made herself 3 years earlier and had altered to fit the current fashion. Graham arrived to collect her in a proper suit, his hair trimmed and his face bright with pleasure. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "You clean up rather well yourself." They entered the ballroom to a flutter of interest, heads turning to note that Graham Oakley had brought a woman to a social event for the first time since his wife's death. Penelope saw Arthur Pemberton and his friends clustered near the punch table, watching with barely concealed anticipation. Arthur raised his glass to her in a mocking salute. Graham noticed the gesture and frowned. "Do you know Arthur Pemberton?" "We've met," Penelope said carefully. "He's not someone I'd choose to associate with. He's not someone anyone should associate with. The man is a parasite living off his father's money and causing trouble for entertainment." Graham led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. "I apologize if he's bothered you. Arthur has a habit of targeting newcomers to town, trying to draw them into his circle before they know better." They danced 3 waltzes, and Penelope felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical thing. This was when she was supposed to complete the bet, to say something cruel and cutting that would humiliate Graham in front of everyone watching. Instead, she found herself holding him tighter, trying to memorize the solid warmth of him and the way he looked at her like she was something precious. "Graham," she said as the 3rd waltz ended, "I need to tell you something. Can we go somewhere private?" He studied her face with concern. "Of course. What's wrong?" She led him out to the Opera House's small side garden where the noise of the ball faded to a distant hum. The night air was cool and smelled of sage from the surrounding hills. Penelope took a deep breath, trying to find the words to begin, when Arthur Pemberton's voice cut through the darkness. "Well, isn't this romantic? The lamb leading the sheep to slaughter." Graham turned sharply as Arthur and his 2 companions emerged from the shadows, all 3 of them grinning like they'd won something. "Pemberton, what the hell are you doing out here?" "Watching the grand finale, of course." "Miss Barrett, are you going to tell him or shall I?" Penelope felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "Get out of here, Arthur." "But we paid good money for this show. $500 to be exact. Tell him, Miss Barrett. Tell Mr. Oakley why you've been so attentive these past 2 months. Tell him about our little wager." Graham looked between them, confusion giving way to something harder. "What is he talking about, Penelope?" There was no way to soften it, no words that would make it better. "Arthur and his friends paid me to court you and then break your heart publicly. They thought it would be entertaining to see you humiliated. I took the money because my father was dying and I was desperate, and I didn't know you then. I thought maybe you deserved it." The silence that followed felt like falling. Graham's face went completely still, all expression draining away until he looked like a man carved from stone. "I see. But I can't do it," Penelope continued desperately. "That's what I brought you out here to tell you. I can't hurt you like that, Graham. You're too good, and what they're asking is too cruel, and I've been sick with guilt for weeks trying to figure out how to fix this." Arthur laughed, the sound sharp with triumph. "Oh, this is even better than I'd hoped. She actually grew a conscience. Oakley, you should see your face. Did you really think a woman like her would want you for yourself? You're dull as dirt and twice as common. She was playing you from the start." Graham didn't look at Arthur. His eyes stayed fixed on Penelope, hazel and full of something that might have been pain or might have been fury. "How much of it was real?" "All of it," Penelope said, her voice breaking. "Everything I said, everything I felt, it was all real. The only lie was why I approached you in the first place. After I got to know you, Graham, I fell in love with you. That's why I can't go through with this." "She's lying," Arthur said cheerfully. "Women like her are professional liars. She's just trying to salvage the situation now that we've called her out." Graham finally turned to look at Arthur, and whatever he saw in Graham's face made Arthur take an involuntary step backward. "You paid a woman to seduce me for a bet. We paid her to break your heart specifically. We're tired of you acting so superior all the time, refusing to gamble with us or drink to excess or have any fun at all. You needed to be reminded that you're not better than everyone else just because you have money and a conscience. And you thought the best way to do that was to hire someone to hurt me. We thought it would be entertaining." Arthur's confidence was starting to fray at the edges. "It's not our fault she couldn't follow through. We held up our end of the bargain." Graham was very quiet for a moment, and Penelope could see him thinking, processing everything. Then he said, his voice deadly calm, "Get out of my sight, all three of you. And if I ever hear of you pulling something like this again, I will personally make sure your father knows exactly what kind of man his son has become. Do you understand me, Arthur? You can't threaten me. Your father is a decent man who would be ashamed to know what you've done. Now get out before I forget I'm supposed to be civilized." Arthur and his friends retreated hastily, their footsteps echoing on the flagstones. When they were gone, Graham turned back to Penelope. "Did they threaten you?" She blinked, surprised. "What? Arthur Pemberton. Did he threaten you about your father's medical care if you didn't complete the bet? How did you know?" "Because that's exactly the kind of thing he would do. He's a bully and a coward, and he targets people who are vulnerable." Graham ran a hand through his hair, disturbing the careful arrangement. "I need you to answer something honestly, Penelope. When you got to know me, when you spent time with me these past weeks, did you genuinely come to care for me? Or was it all performance?" "I love you," Penelope said, the words tumbling out rough with desperation. "I know I have no right to say that after what I've done, and I know you probably hate me now, but it's true. I fell in love with you, Graham, and that's why I couldn't hurt you. That's why I brought you out here to confess everything before Arthur could do it for me." Graham stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her complete shock, he smiled. It was small and slightly bitter, but genuine. "I know. You know. I've suspected for about 3 weeks that something wasn't quite right. You were too interested too quickly, too willing to overlook my reputation as dull and boring. So I asked around and heard rumors about Arthur Pemberton making bets about me. I didn't know the specific terms, but I could guess the general shape of it." Penelope felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You knew, and you kept seeing me anyway." "I kept seeing you because somewhere around the second week, you stopped performing and started being genuine. I could see it in your face, the way you'd look guilty after Arthur spoke to you, the way you'd watch me like you were trying to memorize something important. I knew you were falling for me, Penelope, even if you didn't quite know it yourself yet. And I was falling for you too, so I decided to wait and see what you'd do when it came time to complete the bet. You were testing me. I was giving you the chance to choose, and you chose honesty over money, which is exactly what I hoped you'd do." He stepped closer and took her hands, the same gesture he'd made the night he kissed her. I'm not saying I'm happy about the deception. It hurts that you thought I deserved to be humiliated, even for a moment. But I understand desperation, Penelope. I understand what it's like to make choices you're not proud of because the alternative is worse. You were trying to save your father. I can't fault you for that. I should never have taken the money in the first place. Probably not. But you're giving it back, aren't you? That's what you were coming out here to tell me. Penelope nodded, pulling the envelope from her reticule. It held all $450, every penny she had left after medical expenses. I was planning to return it publicly, expose Arthur and his friends in front of everyone at the ball. I wanted them to face consequences for what they tried to do. Graham took the envelope and hefted it thoughtfully. How about we do something better? Come with me. He led her back inside, through the ballroom where people were still dancing and drinking, and straight to where Arthur Pemberton stood with his companions. The crowd parted as Graham approached, sensing drama. "Pemberton," Graham said loudly enough that nearby conversation stopped, "I believe this belongs to you." He held out the envelope. Arthur took it automatically, confusion clear on his face. "What? Miss Barrett is returning your money. She's decided that your company and your wager aren't worth compromising her integrity. I suggest you take it and leave before I announce to everyone here exactly what kind of bet you made and why." Arthur's face went red, then white. "You wouldn't. Try me. You have 10 seconds to walk out that door before I start talking. And Arthur, if I ever hear of you bothering Miss Barrett or her father again, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every decent person in Virginia City knows what you did. Your father's money won't protect you from social exile." Arthur grabbed his friends and practically ran for the exit, the envelope of money clutched in his hand. The crowd buzzed with speculation, but Graham simply turned to Penelope and offered his arm. "Would you like to finish our dance?" They danced the rest of the night, and when the ball ended, Graham walked her home through Virginia City's lamplit streets. At her door, he said, "I want to court you properly, Penelope. No bets, no deception, just two people getting to know each other honestly. Can we start over?" "What about what I did? Don't you need time to be angry?" "I'm sure I'll be angry later when the shock wears off. But right now, I'm mostly relieved that you chose integrity over money, and I'm grateful that you trusted me enough to tell the truth even when it meant losing everything. That takes courage, Penelope Barrett, and it tells me more about your character than the initial mistake does." She kissed him then, properly and thoroughly, and felt him smile against her mouth. The next morning, Penelope woke to find Dr. Morrison at her door with unexpected news. "Miss Barrett, I had a visit from Graham Oakley last night after the ball. He's arranged to cover your father's medical expenses for the next 6 months, no strings attached. He said to tell you it was because he admired your courage and wanted to make sure you didn't suffer consequences for choosing honesty." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. "He did what? More than that, he's also connected your father with the newspaper editor. Apparently, Mr. Barrett's experience as a printer is exactly what they need for a new press they're installing. It's not strenuous work, mostly setting type and doing layouts, and it pays well enough to cover your room and board." Thomas Barrett, sitting up in bed and looking better than he had in months, beamed at his daughter. "You picked a good man, Penny. Don't let him get away." Penelope spent the morning crying and laughing in equal measure, overwhelmed by Graham's generosity and her own relief. When he came to call that afternoon, she threw herself into his arms without ceremony. "You didn't have to do all that. I know. But I wanted to make sure you were free to choose me because you wanted to, not because you needed my help. This way, you and your father have stability regardless of what happens between us." "What's going to happen between us?" she asked. Graham smiled, the expression transforming his whole face. "If I have my way, everything good, but we'll take it slow and do it right this time." They courted properly over the following months, with Graham calling on her formally and taking her to church socials and town gatherings. Penelope found work as a seamstress through Mrs. Chen, just as Graham had originally suggested, and her father thrived at the newspaper, regaining strength and purpose. The story of Arthur Pemberton's thwarted bet spread through Virginia City's gossip networks, growing more elaborate with each retelling, and Arthur himself left town shortly afterward, his reputation in tatters. Graham took Penelope to the ranch regularly, and she watched the seasons change over the valley, learning the rhythms of the cattle and the land. He taught her to ride, laughing when she proved surprisingly competent, and she taught him to cook more than just basic trail food. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, building the kind of intimacy that came from genuine friendship as much as attraction. 6 months after the miners' ball, Graham proposed on the ranch's front porch at sunset. The valley spread out below them in shades of gold and purple. "I know we've had an unconventional start, but I don't want to waste any more time being cautious. I love you, Penelope Barrett, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" She said yes before he finished the question. They married in October of 1880, a small ceremony at the church with Thomas Barrett proudly walking his daughter down the aisle, and Dr. Morrison serving as Graham's best man. Penelope wore a dress she'd sewn herself from cream-colored silk, and Graham couldn't stop smiling through the entire service. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Graham kissed her thoroughly enough that several people in the congregation laughed. The reception was held at the ranch, with half of Virginia City in attendance. Even people who barely knew Graham and Penelope came, drawn by curiosity about the romance that had apparently started with a bet and ended with true love. Arthur Pemberton's attempted manipulation had become legend, and many people wanted to see the couple who defeated his cruelty with honesty and forgiveness. Mrs. Chen gave them a set of fine china. Dr. Morrison gave them a medical kit with instructions for treating common ranch injuries. The miners from the Silver Queen pooled their money to buy a new stove for the ranch house, presenting it with gruff affection. Thomas Barrett, looking healthier than he had in years, gave his daughter a framed photograph of her mother, who died when Penelope was 12. "She'd be proud of you, Penny. You made a hard choice and a good choice, and you found a man worth keeping." Graham and Penelope settled into married life with surprising ease, their rocky beginning giving way to genuine partnership. She managed the ranch's accounts and logistics, while he handled the cattle and mining operations. They worked side by side to improve the irrigation system, spent evenings reading to each other in front of the fireplace, and slowly transformed the house from Graham's lonely bachelor quarters into a real home. Penelope visited the Silver Queen mine regularly, getting to know the miners and their families. She started a lending library at the mine office, collecting donated books and making sure everyone had access to reading material. Graham introduced more safety protocols and better wages, and the Silver Queen developed a reputation as the best place to work in the Comstock lode. Men who'd worked at other mines sought positions there, knowing Graham Oakley treated his employees like human beings rather than expendable resources. Thomas Barrett continued working at the newspaper and took a room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, maintaining his independence while staying close enough to visit regularly. He became something of a fixture in Virginia City society, known for his storytelling ability and his pride in his daughter's marriage. "That's my Penny," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. "Smart as a whip and brave as a lion. Married the best man in Nevada, she did." A year after the wedding, Penelope realized she was pregnant. She told Graham one evening while they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the same spot where he'd proposed. "We're going to have a baby. Sometime around February, I think." Graham went very still, then pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you sure?" Dr. Morrison confirmed it this morning. "He says I'm perfectly healthy and everything looks normal." "Elizabeth was pregnant when she died," Graham said quietly. "We hadn't told anyone yet. We were going to announce it at her birthday party the week after the cave-in happened. I've always wondered if it was a boy or a girl, what they would have looked like." Penelope held him while he cried, the first time she'd seen him weep since they married. She knew the pregnancy would bring back painful memories, but she also knew Graham well enough now to understand that he wouldn't let fear overshadow joy. He'd learned to carry his grief without letting it consume him, and she trusted him to do the same with this new blessing. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter. Graham became comically overprotective, insisting Penelope rest constantly and avoiding anything that might be remotely strenuous. She tolerated his hovering with amused patience, understanding that his anxiety came from love rather than control. Thomas Barrett visited weekly, bringing gifts for his future grandchild and teasing Graham about his nervousness. "You're going to be one of those fathers who panics at every sneeze," Thomas said, laughing. "Penny survived her entire childhood with me, and I knew nothing about raising children. You'll be fine." Penelope went into labor on a cold February morning with snow falling softly outside. Dr. Morrison arrived quickly, as did Mrs. Chen, who delivered half the babies in Virginia City and brooked no nonsense from anxious fathers. Graham paced the hallway for 6 hours while Penelope labored, and when Dr. Morrison finally emerged to announce the birth of a healthy daughter, Graham nearly knocked him down rushing to get to his wife. Penelope lay exhausted in their bed, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in the quilt Graham's mother had made. "Meet our daughter," she said, smiling. "I thought we could name her Miriam after my mother." Graham took the baby carefully, his large hands cradling her with infinite gentleness, and Penelope watched his face crumple with a complicated mix of grief and joy. "Miriam Elizabeth," he said, "if that's all right with you." "I'd like her to carry Elizabeth's name, too." "Miriam Elizabeth Oakley," Penelope agreed. "It's perfect." Baby Miriam proved to be a surprisingly easy infant, sleeping well and crying only when hungry or uncomfortable. Graham was a devoted father, walking the floors with her at night when she fussed and singing lullabies in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. Penelope watched her husband fall in love with their daughter and felt her own heart expand to accommodate more joy than she'd ever imagined possible. Thomas Barrett doted on his granddaughter, visiting almost daily and insisting on teaching her the alphabet before she could even sit up properly. "It's never too early to start education," he declared, and Penelope let him because he looked so happy doing it. The ranch flourished over the following years. Graham's careful management and fair treatment of workers made the Silver Queen one of the most productive mines in Nevada, and the cattle herd grew steadily. They added more land to the ranch, bought better breeding stock, and built a new barn with proper stalls for the horses. Penelope's seamstress work evolved into designing clothes for Virginia City's wealthier residents, and she became known for her elegant but practical designs. Miriam grew into a bright, curious child with Graham's hazel eyes and Penelope's dark hair. She learned to walk on the ranch's wooden floors, took her first words from her grandfather's newspaper stories, and developed a fearless love of horses that made both her parents nervous. By the time she was 3, She could ride a gentle mare with Graham leading and charmed every ranch hand into spoiling her thoroughly. Arthur Pemberton never returned to Virginia City, though rumors occasionally filtered back about his whereabouts. He'd gone to San Francisco first, then Denver, then somewhere back east, always moving whenever his reputation caught up with him. Penelope occasionally wondered if he'd ever learned anything from his failed bet, but mostly she felt a distant pity for someone who'd never understand the difference between cruelty and cleverness. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Graham took Penelope back to the spot outside the opera house where she'd confessed the bet. The building had been renovated since then, the garden expanded and prettified, but the memory still hung in the air between them. "You ever regret how we started?" he asked, holding her hand. Penelope considered the question seriously. "I regret that I hurt you, even temporarily. I regret that I was desperate enough to take that money in the first place. But I don't regret how it ended, because it forced me to make a choice about the kind of person I wanted to be. And that choice brought me to you, to this life, to Miriam. So no, I don't regret the outcome." "I used to think about what would have happened if you'd gone through with it," Graham admitted. "If you'd broken my heart publicly like they wanted, I'd probably have retreated even further into isolation, convinced it was proof that I didn't deserve happiness after Elizabeth's death. Instead, you chose honesty, and it saved both of us from that fate. You would have survived either way. You're stronger than you think. Maybe, but I wouldn't have thrived, and I definitely wouldn't have this." He gestured at the life they'd built, the ranch visible in the distance, the town spread out below them. "All of this came from one moment of courage when you decided to tell the truth. That's worth celebrating." They went home to find Miriam asleep in Thomas Barrett's arms, the old man dozing in the rocking chair by the fireplace. Dr. Morrison had stopped by with a gift, a silver rattle engraved with Miriam's initials, and stayed for dinner. They sat around the table as the sun set, talking and laughing, and Penelope looked at the faces of everyone she loved and felt a contentment so deep it almost hurt. Thomas Barrett lived to see his granddaughter turn 7, long enough to teach her to read and write and to instill in her a love of stories. He died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1887, and they buried him in Virginia City Cemetery with a headstone that read, "Thomas Barrett, beloved father and grandfather who believed in second chances." Penelope mourned deeply, but without regret, grateful for the extra years they'd had together. Miriam asked questions about death with a child's frank curiosity, and Graham answered them honestly, talking about how people we love stay with us even after they're gone. "Your grandfather loved you very much," he told her. "Every time you read a story or tell a joke, that's him living on through you." The ranch continued to grow, and Graham eventually sold the Silver Queen mine to a company that promised to maintain his safety standards. "I only bought it because Elizabeth loved the idea of me being a mine owner," he told Penelope. "But my heart was always in the land, not underground. It's time to focus on what matters." They used the money from the sale to expand the ranch significantly, buying adjoining properties and building a proper irrigation system that transformed the valley into productive grazing land. Other ranchers started copying Graham's methods, and the area around Virginia City became known for quality cattle and smart land management. Miriam grew into a strong-willed young woman who inherited her father's business sense and her mother's sharp eye for detail. She learned ranching from the ground up, insisting on working alongside the hands despite Graham's initial reluctance to let his daughter do dangerous work. "You let me learn to ride when I was 3, she pointed out logically. "This is no different." Penelope watched her daughter grow and sometimes marveled at how different Miriam's life was from her own childhood. Where Penelope had known instability and fear, Miriam knew security and confidence. Where Penelope had learned to be careful and calculating, Miriam learned to be bold and direct. It was everything Penelope had hoped for and more. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Graham surprised Penelope by taking her to San Francisco for a week, leaving Miriam in the capable hands of the ranch foreman and his wife. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate at restaurants, saw plays at the theater, and spent hours walking through the city's hilly streets like the young couple they'd never quite had the chance to be. "I want to show you something," Graham said on their last evening, leading her to a gallery near Union Square. Inside, displayed prominently, was a painting of Virginia City at sunset, the mountains purple against a gold sky. "I commissioned it last year from an artist who specializes in Western landscapes. I wanted something to remind us of where we came from, all the good and the difficult parts." Penelope studied the painting, recognizing the opera house where they'd danced at the miners' ball, the church where they'd married, the hills leading to the ranch. "It's beautiful." "It's us," Graham corrected. "Our whole story in one frame. I thought we could hang it in the parlor, so Miriam grows up knowing where she came from." They brought the painting home and hung it over the fireplace, and it became a focal point of the house. Visitors would ask about it, and Graham and Penelope would tell the story of how they met, leaving out the more painful details, but keeping the essential truth that honesty and courage had brought them together. The years passed with the comfortable rhythm of a well-lived life. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, weathered droughts and harsh winters, mourned when friends died and rejoiced when new babies were born. Graham went gray at the temples and developed lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. Penelope's hands grew calloused from ranch work, and her face weathered from wind and weather. They aged together, their love deepening from passionate romance into something more durable and profound. Miriam married at 22, choosing a young veterinarian who'd moved to Virginia City to establish a practice. Graham walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and Penelope watched her daughter make vows and remembered her own wedding day, how nervous and hopeful she'd been. "We did well," Graham said that night, holding Penelope close in their bed. "She's happy and confident and choosing her own path. That's all we could ask for." "She has your integrity," Penelope said, "and hopefully some of my practicality. She'll be fine." Miriam and her husband built a house on ranch land, close enough for family dinners but far enough for independence. When Miriam announced her own pregnancy a year later, Graham became a grandfather with the same fierce devotion he'd shown as a father. Penelope watched him with their grandchild and saw echoes of the man who'd held baby Miriam with such tender care, and she fell in love with him all over again. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them on the ranch's front porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of crimson and gold. Graham held Penelope's hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm, and said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For coming back that night, for choosing truth over money, for loving me despite how we started, for building this life with me." He gestured at the ranch, the valley, the world they'd created together. "None of this happens if you'd made a different choice that night at the ball. I'd still be alone in this big house, punishing myself for Elizabeth's death and calling it penance. You saved me, Penelope. I want you to know that." "You saved me too," she said. "I was becoming someone I didn't like, someone who valued money over integrity. You gave me the chance to choose better, and you forgave me when I made mistakes. That's the real gift, Graham. Not the money or the security or even the love, though that matters most of all. The gift was being allowed to be imperfect and still be worthy. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and stars began emerging in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear Miriam's laughter and the baby's happy gurgling. The cattle lowed softly in the pastures, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage from the hills. "Tell me something," Graham said after a while. "If you could go back to that day when Arthur Pemberton offered you the bet, knowing everything that would happen afterward, would you still take the money?" Penelope thought about it seriously. "No, not because it ended badly, but because it started wrong. I'd find another way to help my father, even if it took longer or was harder. But I'm grateful that I made the mistakes I did, because they taught me what matters and they brought me to you. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. I feel the same about Elizabeth's death and the cave-in. I wouldn't wish for it to happen, but it made me who I am, and who I am is someone who deserves you. The pain shaped me into someone capable of recognizing love when it arrived in the form of a beautiful woman taking money to break my heart. I never actually broke it, though," Penelope pointed out. "I just bent it a little." Graham laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "You bent it in all the right ways, making room for something bigger than grief and guilt. I love you, Penelope Oakley. I loved you when you were lying to me, and I loved you when you told the truth, and I'll love you every day we have left together." "That's a long time," Penelope said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We could have decades left. Then I'll love you for decades. And when our time is done, I'll love you in whatever comes after, just like I still love Elizabeth but differently now, with gratitude instead of grief. Love doesn't run out, Penelope. It just grows and changes and makes room for more." They sat together until full dark, then went inside to their family and their life, carrying with them the knowledge that they'd built something lasting from the most imperfect beginning. The portrait of Virginia City hung above the fireplace, capturing forever the town where a desperate woman took money to break a lonely man's heart, then chose courage over cruelty, and found love in the most unexpected place. Years later, when Miriam's children asked about how their grandparents met, Penelope would tell them the truth, holding nothing back because she wanted them to understand that people made mistakes and learned from them. "Your grandfather could have hated me," she'd say, "and he would have been justified. But instead, he chose forgiveness, and that changed everything. Remember that when you're faced with someone who's wronged you. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give is the chance to make a different choice." Graham would add, "And sometimes the greatest courage is admitting when you're wrong and trying to make it right. Your grandmother did that when it would have been easier to complete the bet and take the money. She chose integrity, and that's worth more than all the silver in Nevada." The children would listen with wide eyes, and then run off to play, carrying with them the story of how love could grow from the rockiest soil if you tended it with honesty and care. And Penelope and Graham would watch them go, hands linked, hearts full, grateful for every choice that had led them to this moment and to each other. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down to Miriam and eventually to her children, each one adding their own improvements while maintaining the core values Graham had established. The Silver Queen mine closed eventually, the silver playing out as all mines eventually did, but the ranch endured because land, properly cared for, lasted longer than precious metals. Graham died first, at 73, peacefully in his sleep with Penelope beside him. He'd lived long enough to see his grandchildren grown and his great-grandchildren born, long enough to know that everything he'd built would continue after him. Penelope mourned deeply, but without despair, grateful for the 40-plus years they'd had together and secure in the knowledge that she'd loved him well and been loved in return. She lived another 8 years, spending her time with family and friends, telling stories to anyone who'd listen about the old days in Virginia City, when silver poured from the mountains and people made their fortunes, or lost everything trying. She talked about Graham with love and laughter, keeping his memory alive not through grief, but through celebration of the life they'd shared. When Penelope died at 81, surrounded by 3 generations of family, her last words were about the night at the miners' ball when she'd chosen truth over money and changed the course of her entire life. "Best decision I ever made," she whispered, and then closed her eyes for the final time, a smile on her weathered face. They buried her next to Graham on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "Penelope Barrett, Oakley, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, who chose courage when it mattered most." And beneath it, smaller but no less important, she kept her heart by giving it away. The portrait of Virginia City remained hanging in the ranch house's parlor, passing through generations, a reminder of where the family had started and how far they'd come. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set just right, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple, family members would gather on the front porch and tell the story of Graham and Penelope, the rancher and the seamstress who'd built something lasting from the most imperfect beginning. It became a legend of sorts, the tale of the bet that backfired, the woman who chose integrity, and the man who forgave her and kept her anyway. Young people in love would visit the ranch and ask to hear the story, hoping some of that magic would rub off on their own relationships. And the Oakley descendants would tell it gladly, emphasizing the parts about honesty and forgiveness and courage, teaching each new generation that love worth having was love worth fighting for, even when the fight was against your own worst impulses. Because in the end, that's what the story was really about. Not the bet or the money or even the romance, though those were all important pieces. It was about becoming the kind of person who deserved the love they wanted, about making hard choices when easier ones beckoned, about forgiveness and second chances, and the incredible grace of being loved despite your flaws. Graham and Penelope had understood that, had lived it every day of their marriage, and had passed that understanding down through their daughter and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It became the foundation of the family, more valuable than land or money or legacy, the simple truth that people made mistakes but could choose to be better, that love could grow from rocky soil if you tended it with care, and that sometimes the greatest courage was admitting you were wrong and asking for the chance to make it right. The ranch still stands, over 100 years later, still producing cattle and still managed by Oakley descendants. The portrait of Virginia City hangs in its place of honor, the colors faded but the image still clear. And on quiet evenings, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of a conversation from long ago, when a woman confessed her deception, and a man chose forgiveness, and together they built something that would last generations. That's the legacy Graham and Penelope left behind. Not silver or land or even the successful ranch, though those mattered. The real legacy was the example they set, the story they told through their lives about what it meant to love someone fully and honestly, flaws and all. They showed their family and everyone who knew them that perfection wasn't required for happiness, only courage and integrity and the willingness to keep choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through everything life brought their way. And in the end, isn't that what every great love story teaches us? That love isn't about grand gestures or perfect beginnings, but about the daily choice to be honest and kind and present, to forgive mistakes and celebrate victories, to build something lasting from whatever materials were given, even if those materials include a cruel bet and a desperate decision, and $500 that could have destroyed everything, but instead became the foundation for something beautiful. Graham and Penelope understood that truth from the moment she confessed outside the opera house, and he chose to believe in her capacity for change. They lived it through 43 years of marriage, through good times and hard times, through joy and grief, and everything in between. And when they died, they left behind not just property or possessions, but a template for how to love well and honestly, a gift that proved more valuable than all the silver in the Comstock lode. That's the story Miriam told her children, and they told theirs, and so on down through the generations. The specifics might have varied slightly with each telling, but the core remained constant. A woman took money to break a man's heart, chose integrity instead, and the man kept her anyway, because what they'd found together was too precious to lose over a mistake made in desperation. It's a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth living. Because we all make mistakes, all face moments when we must choose between what's easy and what's right, all need the grace of being forgiven and the courage to forgive. Graham and Penelope's story reminds us that those moments define us, that the choices we make when we're tested reveal who we really are, and that sometimes the greatest love stories start with the most imperfect beginnings. So the portrait hangs in the ranch house parlor, the land continues to produce, and the family carries on, each generation adding their own chapter to the story that started with $500 and a bet, and ended with a love that lasted lifetimes and taught everyone who heard about it that integrity and courage were worth more than any amount of money, and that choosing truth, even when it cost everything, was always the right choice. And somewhere, perhaps, Graham and Penelope watch over the ranch they built together, satisfied with what they created and how it endured, proud of the family they raised and the example they set, content in the knowledge that they loved well and honestly and left the world better than they found it. That's all anyone can hope for, really, to love and be loved, to make mistakes and learn from them, to build something that lasts beyond yourself, and to leave behind the kind of story that makes people believe in courage and forgiveness, and the transformative power of choosing integrity over convenience. That's what Graham Oakley and Penelope Barrett did. They built a love story for the ages from the most unpromising materials, and in doing so, they built a legacy that continues to inspire everyone who hears their tale. The cowboy who kept the woman despite her deception because he recognized courage when he saw it, and the woman who returned the money because she couldn't bear to hurt someone she'd come to love together. They proved that love wasn't about perfection but about choosing each other, honestly and completely, every single day. And that, in the end, is the greatest story anyone can tell.